Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The free rider problem: why nobody pays for what everyone wants. A community needs a public good, needs streetlights perhaps, or clean air or national defense. And this good has a special property. It is non-excludable. Once provided, it is available to everyone, regardless of whether they contributed to its provision. And it is non-rivalrous. One person's use does not reduce availability for others. And these properties create a problem. Create incentives for free riding, for enjoying the benefits without bearing the costs, and each individual reasons that their contribution is small, is negligible, will not determine whether the good is provided, and so they can free ride, can enjoy the streetlights, whether they pay or not. And since paying is costly, and the good will be provided or not, regardless of their individual contribution, it is individually rational to free ride. And if everyone reasons this way, then no one contributes. The good is not provided, and everyone is worse off than if everyone had contributed. And this is the free rider problem, a fundamental challenge in public economics, a demonstration that voluntary provision of public goods is difficult, tends toward under-provision, and solving the problem requires mechanisms that make contribution individually rational, requires collective action, requires institutions that enable groups to provide goods that individuals cannot or will not provide voluntarily. And the free rider problem explains why governments exist, why taxation is necessary, why voluntary charity is insufficient for providing public goods. And the problem remains central to political philosophy, to debates about the role of government, to questions about when collective coercion is justified. Imagine a neighbourhood deciding whether to install streetlights, and the lights would benefit everyone, would make the streets safer, would be valued by all residents. And suppose the lights cost $100 per household, and each household values the lights at $150. So collectively, the benefit exceeds the cost. Provision is efficient, but each household faces a decision: contribute or free ride. And the calculation is straightforward. If enough others contribute, the lights will be installed regardless of whether I contribute. And if I contribute, I pay $100 and get $150 of benefit for net benefits of $50. But if I free ride, I pay nothing and still get $150 of benefit for net benefit of $150. So I am better off free riding, and if not enough others contribute, then the lights will not be installed regardless of whether I contribute. And if I contribute, I pay $100 and get nothing because the lights are not installed. And if I free ride, I pay nothing and get nothing. So I am no worse off free riding, and in both cases, free riding dominates contributing. And since every household reasons this way, no one contributes, the lights are not installed, and everyone loses the net benefit they could have had. And this is the free rider problem. The free rider problem demonstrates that individual rationality can lead to collective inefficiency, that goods which everyone wants can fail to be provided because no individual has incentive to contribute, and the problem is structural, is inherent in the properties of public goods, and cannot be solved by appealing to altruism or social responsibility, because even small amounts of altruism are insufficient. Because as long as some people free ride, the burden on contributors increases, and this creates resentment, undermines cooperation, and voluntary provision tends to fail. And the solution typically involves coercion, involves mandatory contributions through taxation, and governments exist partly to solve free rider problems, to provide public goods through collective funding, and taxation is justified on the grounds that it enables provision of goods that voluntary contribution cannot reliably provide. Visualize the free rider problem as a threshold public good, where the good is provided only if total contributions exceed some threshold, and individuals must decide whether to contribute without knowing whether others will contribute, and the dominant strategy is to free ride because your contribution is costly and makes little difference to whether the threshold is met, and everyone free rides. The threshold is not met. The good is not provided, and this shows why voluntary provision fails, why collective action problems arise, why coordination on contribution is difficult without institutional mechanisms. And solving the problem requires commitment devices, requires mechanisms that ensure contributions are made, that prevent free riding, and taxation is one such mechanism, makes contribution mandatory, eliminates the free riding option, and enables provision of public goods that markets fail to provide. One response to the free rider problem is Lindahl taxation, a theoretical solution where each individual pays according to their marginal benefit from the public good, pays their willingness to pay, and this makes contribution individually rational because you pay only what the good is worth to you. But Lindahl taxation faces practical problems, requires knowing each person's valuation, which people have incentive to misrepresent, have incentive to understate to reduce their tax burden, and the mechanism is not incentive compatible, is vulnerable to strategic behaviour, and cannot be implemented in practice. And so while Lindahl taxation is theoretically optimal, it does not solve the real-world free rider problem. Another response is assurance contracts, where contributions are collected conditionally, are returned if the threshold is not met. And this solves one problem with voluntary provision, eliminates the risk of contributing without the good being provided. But assurance contracts do not eliminate free riding incentive, do not make contributing dominant, because you still benefit from the good whether you contribute or not. And so assurance contracts help but do not fully solve the problem, and empirical evidence shows that contribution rates improve with assurance contracts but remain below optimal levels. A third response is social sanctions, where free riders are punished through social disapproval, through reputation loss, through exclusion from other cooperative activities, and social sanctions can support contribution in small groups where behaviour is observable, where reputation matters, where repeated interaction creates incentives for cooperation, and community provision of public goods often relies on social sanctions, relies on norms that support contribution and punish free riding. And these mechanisms can be effective in tight-knit communities but are less effective in large anonymous societies where behaviour is hard to observe and reputation effects are weak. The free rider problem also appears in debates about international cooperation, about providing global public goods like climate stability, pandemic prevention, biodiversity preservation, and these goods are non-excludable and non-rivalrous at global scale, and nations face free rider incentives, benefit from the good whether they contribute or not, and this makes international cooperation difficult, makes agreements fragile, and nations have incentive to free ride, to benefit from others' contributions while minimizing their own. And solving global free rider problems requires international institutions, requires mechanisms for monitoring and enforcement, requires ways to make contribution individually rational for nations. And the difficulty of achieving such cooperation explains why global public goods are underprovided, why climate change proceeds despite universal acknowledgement of its dangers, why pandemic preparedness is inadequate despite obvious benefits. The problem also raises philosophical questions about political obligation, about whether citizens have duties to support public goods, whether taxation is legitimate coercion or justified contribution, and libertarians argue that taxation for public goods is problematic, violates individual rights, and anarcho-capitalists argue that even genuine public goods should be provided voluntarily or not at all, while social democrats argue that taxation is justified to solve collective action problems, is necessary for provision of goods, that voluntary mechanisms cannot reliably provide, and the debate turns on whether the free rider problem justifies coercion, whether preventing free riding is sufficient reason to impose mandatory contributions, and different political philosophies answer differently. Some argue that the free rider problem is overstated, that voluntary provision is more successful than theory predicts, that people do contribute to public goods despite free rider incentives. And empirical evidence supports this, shows that people do contribute voluntarily to charities, to public radio, to open source software, and contribution rates exceed zero even when free riding is possible. And this suggests that people are not purely self-interested, have preferences for fairness, for contributing to collective goods, for avoiding being seen as free riders, and behavioral economics explains these patterns through social preferences, through conditional cooperation, through warm glow effects from giving, and while voluntary provision remains below optimal levels, it is not zero, and this shows that humans are more cooperative than pure economic theory predicts. But it does not eliminate the free rider problem, does not make voluntary provision reliably sufficient, and government provision remains necessary for most public goods. The streetlights remain dark, the clean air remains polluted, the defence remains unprovided, and everyone wishes for the public good, but no one contributes. Everyone free rides, everyone waits for others to pay, and the good is not provided, and the free rider problem persists as one of the fundamental challenges in political economy, remains a justification for government, remains a reason why taxation exists, why collective provision is necessary, and the problem shows that markets fail for public goods, that voluntary mechanisms are insufficient, that individual rationality leads to collective inefficiency, and solving the problem requires institutions, requires mechanisms that make contribution mandatory, or that change incentives to make contribution rational, and without such mechanisms, public goods are underprovided. Remain goods that everyone wants but nobody provides, and the free rider problem endures. The crocodile dilemma, when a monster's promise makes truth deadly. A crocodile seizes a child from the riverbank, snatches the infant in its jaws, and the mother screams and begs for her child's return, and the crocodile, cunning and cruel, makes an offer. The crocodile says, "I will return your child if you correctly predict what I will do, if you say truly whether I will return the child or not." And the mother must choose, must predict the crocodile's action, and if she predicts correctly, she gets her child back. And if she predicts incorrectly, the crocodile keeps the child. And this seems straightforward at first, seems like a gamble with 50-50 odds. But the mother is clever, thinks carefully, and realizes she can construct a prediction that creates a paradox. And she says to the crocodile, "You will not return my child." And now the crocodile faces an impossible choice, a logical trap from which there is no escape. And this is the crocodile dilemma, an ancient paradox from Greek and Roman philosophy that illustrates how self-reference and promises can generate contradictions that have no resolution. Imagine the crocodile processing the mother's prediction. She has said, the crocodile will not return the child, and the crocodile must decide whether this prediction is true or false. And if the prediction is true, then the crocodile will not return the child, but the promise was to return the child. If the prediction is correct, and the prediction is correct, so the crocodile must return the child. But returning the child makes the prediction false, because the prediction said the child would not be returned. And if the prediction is false, then the crocodile is not obligated to return the child, but not returning the child makes the prediction true. And if it is true, the crocodile must return the child, and the cycle repeats. And the crocodile is stuck, unable to act, unable to fulfill the promise without violating it, unable to violate it without fulfilling it, and the paradox is complete. Visualize the crocodile frozen at the water's edge, jaws clamped around the child, mind caught in a logical loop, every option leading to contradiction, and the mother waits, and the crocodile cannot move forward or backward, cannot return the child or keep the child without creating impossibility. and the promise that seemed simple, seemed like a straightforward conditional, has become a trap, has revealed that some promises are unkeepable, some conditionals are incoherent when their conditions refer to their own fulfillment. The dilemma is structurally similar to the liar paradox, involves self-reference creating contradiction, because the mother's prediction refers to the crocodile's action, and the crocodile's action depends on whether the prediction is true, and the prediction's truth depends on the action. And this circular dependency creates a situation where no consistent assignment of truth values is possible, where any choice by the crocodile contradicts the conditions of the promise. And the paradox shows that not all promises can be kept, not all conditionals can be satisfied, especially when the condition refers to the action that depends on the condition. One proposed resolution is that the crocodile's promise is defective, is not a genuine promise, but a linguistic trick, because promises must be performable, must create obligations that can be fulfilled, and the crocodile's promise creates an obligation that cannot be fulfilled when the mother makes the strategic prediction, and so the promise is void. The crocodile is not bound by it, and the crocodile can do whatever it chooses without violating any obligation, and by this resolution, the crocodile keeps the child, the mother loses. Not because her prediction was wrong, but because she made a prediction that made the promise unenforceable, and the dilemma is resolved by rejecting the premise that the promise binds the crocodile in paradoxical cases. Another resolution distinguishes between the crocodile's intentions at the moment of making the promise and the actual outcome, and argues that the promise should be interpreted as concerning the crocodile's intended action, not the final action after considering the prediction, and when the mother predicts the child will not be returned, the crocodile evaluates whether to intend to return the child, and if the crocodile's initial intention is not to return the child, then the prediction is correct, and the crocodile should return the child according to the promise. And this return action does not create a contradiction, because the promise was about the intention, not about the final action. But this resolution seems strained, seems to reinterpret the promise in ways that were not clearly intended. And it is not obvious that distinguishing intention from action resolves the paradox or merely shifts it. A third resolution embraces the paradox and argues that it shows the limits of what can be promised, that some conditionals are inherently problematic, that promises whose conditions involve self-reference or depend on the promiser's response to the condition create logical tangles that cannot be resolved, and rational agents should avoid making such promises, should recognize that not every grammatically well-formed conditional statement creates a genuine obligation, and the crocodile's mistake was offering a promise whose structure allowed paradoxical predictions. And once the paradox emerges, the crocodile is released from the promise, is in a situation where any action is permissible because no action can satisfy the promise, and morality and logic give no guidance. The crocodile dilemma also illustrates issues in game theory and strategic reasoning, because the mother is using her prediction strategically, choosing her words not to convey her genuine belief about what the crocodile will do, but to create a situation where the crocodile cannot win. And this strategic use of language, using predictions not to predict, but to constrain, appears in negotiations, legal arguments, and political discourse, where statements are crafted to create binds, to force opponents into positions where any response is disadvantageous, and the dilemma shows that self-referential statements can be weapons, can be used to trap others in paradoxes where no good option exists. The dilemma has modern variants involving computers and artificial intelligence, where programs might be given instructions that are self-referential, that depend on the program's own output in ways that create paradox, and programmers must be careful to avoid such loops, must ensure that conditionals do not refer to their own evaluation in ways that create infinite regress or contradiction. And the crocodile dilemma serves as a warning, a reminder that self-reference is dangerous, creates problems that cannot always be resolved by cleverness or by trying harder, but only by recognizing the structure and avoiding it. The child hangs in the crocodile's jaws. The mother waits for an answer, and the crocodile is paralyzed by logic, cannot move without contradiction, and the ancient paradox remains, unsolved, unresolvable, a trap that philosophy has not escaped, a reminder that language can create impossibilities, that promises can be unkeepable, that self-reference generates paradoxes that defy solution, and the crocodile dilemma endures, taught in logic classes, discussed in philosophy seminars, a vivid example of how words can bind more tightly than chains, how a simple promise can become an impossible obligation, and how the combination of self-reference and conditionality creates contradictions from which there is no escape, and the crocodile remains frozen, the child unclaimed, and the paradox persists, waiting at the riverbank for the next clever victim to spring the trap. The frozen time paradox. Time flows, or so it seems, carrying events from past to present to future in an unbroken stream. Yet what if time could stop? What if every process in the universe froze for a moment, or an hour, or 1,000 years, and then resumed exactly as it was? Would anyone notice? Could anyone notice? And this is the frozen time paradox, a thought experiment that questions whether time itself is observable, or whether it is merely an ordering of events, invisible and perhaps illusory. Imagine that at this very moment time stops. Every atom ceases to move, every thought halts mid-formation, every photon hangs suspended in space, the entire universe frozen in a perfect still image. And this frozen state persists for an arbitrary duration, perhaps 1 billion years, and then suddenly time resumes, and everything continues exactly as it was. And the question arises, did anything happen during that frozen interval? Did time pass? And if no change occurred, can it be said that any time elapsed at all? The paradox strikes at the relationship between time and change, suggesting that time without change is meaningless or undetectable, that the passage of time is defined by the occurrence of events, and that if nothing changes, then nothing distinguishes one moment from another, and so the frozen interval, no matter how long, is equivalent to no interval at all. Aristotle grappled with this issue, arguing that time is the measure of change, that time does not exist independently of the processes it measures, and that without motion or change there can be no time. And this view suggests that the frozen time scenario is not a case of time continuing without change, but rather a case of time ceasing to exist during the frozen period. Others, particularly those who embrace the block universe view, argue that time is an independent dimension of space-time, that it exists whether or not anything changes within it, that the frozen interval would be a real extension of time, even if no events occurred within it. Though this raises the question of how such an interval could ever be detected or have any physical meaning. The paradox also touches on the nature of consciousness and subjective experience, because if time froze and then resumed, no conscious being would remember the frozen period, no measurement device would register it, no physical process would show evidence that it occurred, and so in what sense did it happen? And if it leaves no trace, can it be said to have any reality at all? Some philosophers draw a distinction between time as a parameter in physical equations, a variable that describes when things happen, and time as it is experienced, the feeling of duration and flow. And they suggest that the frozen time paradox exposes a gap between these two concepts, that mathematical time might continue during a frozen interval, but experiential time would not. The paradox connects to debates about the reality of time, whether time is fundamental or emergent, whether it is a feature of the universe or a feature of how we perceive the universe, and whether the flow of time, the sense that the present moment is moving forward, is an objective fact or a subjective illusion created by consciousness. Quantum mechanics adds another layer to the puzzle, because at the quantum level, the concept of time becomes strange. Entangled states do not evolve smoothly, but exist in superposition until measured. And some interpretations suggest that time emerges from quantum correlations rather than being a fundamental aspect of reality. The frozen time paradox forces confrontation with the question of what time is, whether it is possible for time to exist without change, whether duration has meaning in the absence of events, and whether the universe could be paused and unpaused without anyone ever knowing, without any physical consequence, and if such a scenario is indistinguishable from time continuing normally, then perhaps the question itself is meaningless, a pseudo-problem that arises from thinking about time as if it were a substance that flows rather than a dimension that orders. And yet the intuition remains that time is real, that it passes, that moments follow one another, and the paradox lingers as a reminder that even this most basic aspect of existence, the passage of time, is far from fully understood. The Euthyphro dilemma. Is murder wrong because God says so, or does God say so because it's wrong? In ancient Athens, a young man named Euthyphro encounters Socrates on the steps of the courthouse, and Euthyphro is prosecuting his own father for murder. And Socrates, ever curious, asks Euthyphro to explain what piety is. What makes an action holy or righteous? And Euthyphro confidently responds that pious actions are those loved by the gods, and impious actions are those hated by the gods. And Socrates, never satisfied with simple answers, poses a question that has echoed through philosophy and theology for over 2,000 years. He asks whether the gods love pious actions because those actions are pious, or whether actions are pious because the gods love them. And this question, now called the Euthyphro dilemma, presents a fundamental challenge to divine command theory. The view that morality depends on God's will, that actions are right or wrong because God commands or forbids them, and the dilemma forces a choice between two uncomfortable options, each with troubling implications for the relationship between God and morality. Imagine the first horn of the dilemma. Suppose that actions are good because God commands them, that rightness is simply whatever God says is right, and wrongness is whatever God forbids, and there is no independent standard of goodness, no morality that exists prior to or apart from God's commands. And God could have commanded anything, could have made murder obligatory and charity forbidden, could have declared torture virtuous and compassion wicked, and whatever God commanded would be right by definition. And this seems to make morality arbitrary, seems to empty moral terms of their content. Because if good just means commanded by God, then saying God commands what is good becomes a tautology, becomes equivalent to saying God commands what God commands, which is trivial, tells us nothing, and more troublingly, this view seems to undermine the idea that God is good, because if goodness is defined by God's commands, then calling God good just means God does what God commands, which again is trivial, and we lose the ability to praise God's goodness as something meaningful, as something that transcends mere consistency with divine will. Visualize a world where this view is true, where morality is purely a matter of divine fiat, and God announces new commandments, declares that from now on, stealing is virtuous and honesty is sin, and according to divine command theory, this announcement would make stealing right and honesty wrong, because rightness just is whatever God says, and we would be obligated to become thieves, obligated to lie. And this seems absurd, seems to violate our deepest moral intuitions, because we feel that stealing and lying are wrong for reasons that have nothing to do with commands, that they harm people, violate trust, undermine cooperation, and these reasons would exist even if God commanded otherwise. And so morality seems to have a structure, a logic that cannot be altered by divine decree. And this suggests that the first horn of the dilemma is unacceptable, that we should reject the idea that actions are good merely because God commands them. Now consider the second horn. Suppose that God commands actions because those actions are good, that there is an independent standard of goodness, a moral truth that exists prior to God's commands. And God, being perfectly good and perfectly wise, recognizes this moral truth and commands accordingly. And God commands charity because charity is good, forbids murder because murder is bad, and the goodness and badness exist independently of the commands. And this seems more plausible, seems to preserve the meaningfulness of moral language and the praiseworthiness of God's goodness. But it creates a different problem, because if moral truth is independent of God, then God is not the ultimate source of morality. God does not create right and wrong, but merely recognizes and reveals them. And there is something above God, a standard of goodness to which even God is subject. And this seems to limit God's sovereignty, seems to place constraints on divine power and authority. And many theologians find this unacceptable, argue that nothing can be above God, that God is the ultimate reality, the ground of all being, and making morality independent of God seems to dethrone God, to reduce God to a mere messenger of moral truths that exist on their own. The dilemma presents a forced choice: either accept that morality is arbitrary, dependent on God's will, capable of being anything God decrees, or accept that morality is independent of God, existing prior to divine commands, limiting God's sovereignty. And neither option is attractive to believers who want to say both that God is the source of morality and that God's commands reflect genuine moral truth rather than arbitrary preference. And various theological and philosophical responses have been proposed over the centuries, attempting to escape between the horns to find a position that preserves both divine sovereignty and moral objectivity. One response associated with medieval theologians like Duns Scotus embraces the first horn, accepts that morality depends entirely on God's will, and bites the bullet on arbitrariness, arguing that God's commands are not arbitrary in any problematic sense because God is perfectly rational and benevolent. And while God could have commanded otherwise, God would never do so. And God's nature ensures that divine commands will align with what promotes flourishing and well-being. And so while morality is ultimately grounded in God's will, it is not random or capricious. And this response tries to have it both ways, tries to say that morality depends on God's will, but is still stable and reasonable because God's character is stable and reasonable. But critics argue that this just pushes the problem back, because now we are saying God's character is good. And what does good mean here? If goodness is defined by God's will, then saying God's character is good is circular. And if goodness is independent, then we are back on the second horn. Another response associated with Aquinas and natural law theory embraces the second horn but softens it, argues that moral truth is not independent of God but is part of God's nature, is rooted in the divine essence, and God's commands reflect God's eternal nature rather than arbitrary choices. And goodness is not external to God but internal, is what God is, and God commands what is good because God is goodness itself. And this unites God and morality, makes them inseparable, avoids both arbitrariness and external constraint. But critics argue that this is just wordplay, that if moral truth is part of God's nature, then it is still independent in the relevant sense, still not something God creates or controls, and the question remains whether God could have had a different nature. And if so, we are back to arbitrariness. And if not, then something constrains God's nature, something makes God's nature what it is, and we are back to external constraints. A third response from some modern philosophers rejects the dilemma entirely, argues that it presents a false choice, that it assumes moral realism, assumes that moral truths exist objectively, either dependent on God or independent, but perhaps moral truth is neither. Perhaps morality is a human construction, a set of norms we create to facilitate cooperation, and God's role is to guide this construction, to reveal which norms best serve human flourishing, and this avoids both horns by denying the assumption that moral truth exists in any absolute sense, but it creates new problems, makes morality relative or subjective, undermines the claim that moral truths are objective facts that God knows and humans can discover, and many find this solution worse than the original dilemma. The Euthyphro dilemma appears not just in theology, but in secular ethics as well, because any attempt to ground morality in authority faces the same structure. If we say actions are right because society approves them, we can ask whether society approves them because they are right, or whether they are right because society approves them. And the dilemma recurs: arbitrariness on one side, independent moral truth on the other, and the same choice must be faced. And this suggests that the dilemma is not specifically about God, but about the relationship between authority and morality, about whether moral truth can be grounded in will, in decision, in command, or whether it must exist independently of any authority, answerable to reason or nature or some other source. Socrates stands on the courthouse steps, questioning Euthyphro, probing the foundations of piety, and the young man's confidence wavers. His simple answer unravels, and the dilemma emerges, stark and unavoidable. And 25 centuries later, the question remains: does God command the good because it is good, or is it good because God commands it? And theologians and philosophers continue to debate, continue to propose solutions, continue to struggle with a choice that seems to force a sacrifice: either God's sovereignty or morality's objectivity, either divine authority or moral truth. And the dilemma persists, unresolved, a permanent fixture in philosophy of religion, a challenge to anyone who wants to ground ethics in divine will, and a reminder that even the most fundamental questions about the source of right and wrong, about the relationship between God and goodness, about whether morality is created or discovered, remain open, remain contested, and the young Euthyphro walks away confused, and Socrates continues to question, and the dilemma remains, waiting to challenge every new generation of believers and philosophers who confront the ancient problem of how God and morality relate. The Ellsberg paradox. An urn contains 90 balls, 30 of which are red, and 60 of which are some mix of black and yellow, but the exact proportions of black and yellow are unknown. The 60 non-red balls could be all black, all yellow, or any combination, and you are offered a series of bets, and the choices you face reveal a pattern of preferences that violates the standard axioms of rational decision theory. And this is the Ellsberg paradox, named after Daniel Ellsberg, who presented it in 1961. And the paradox demonstrates that people systematically prefer known probabilities to unknown probabilities, exhibiting what is called ambiguity aversion, a tendency to avoid situations where the probabilities are uncertain. And this preference pattern cannot be accommodated by expected utility theory, which requires that rational agents have well-defined subjective probabilities for all events and choose actions that maximize expected utility, calculated using these probabilities. The first bet involves choosing between two options. Bet A pays if a red ball is drawn, and bet B pays if a black ball is drawn. And most people prefer bet A, preferring to bet on red, where the probability is known to be 30 out of 90, 1/3, rather than betting on black, where the probability is unknown, could be anything from 0 to 60 out of 90. And this preference seems reasonable, seems to reflect a cautious attitude toward uncertainty, a desire to avoid ambiguity. The second bet offers a choice between bet C, which pays if a red or yellow ball is drawn, and bet D, which pays if a black or yellow ball is drawn, and most people prefer bet D, preferring to bet on black or yellow, where the combined probability is known to be 60 out of 90, 2/3, rather than betting on red or yellow, where the probability depends on the unknown proportion of yellow balls. The paradox emerges when these two preferences are combined, because preferring bet A to bet B suggests that the person believes red is more likely than black, that they implicitly assign a higher subjective probability to red, and preferring bet D to bet C suggests that they believe black or yellow is more likely than red or yellow, which implies that black is more likely than red. And these two beliefs are contradictory. If red is more likely than black, then red or yellow should be more likely than black or yellow, given that both involve adding the same unknown proportion of yellow. And so the preference pattern violates the sure thing principle, the axiom that if you prefer X to Y when some event E occurs, and you also prefer X to Y when E does not occur, then you should prefer X to Y unconditionally, regardless of whether you know whether E occurred. The Ellsberg paradox cannot be explained by standard subjective probability theory because any consistent assignment of subjective probabilities to red, black, and yellow would make the preference for A over B incompatible with the preference for D over C. And so the pattern reveals that people do not have well-defined subjective probabilities for ambiguous events, or that they do not maximize expected utility using those probabilities, and instead they exhibit a preference for known over unknown probabilities, a violation of the completeness axiom of decision theory, which requires that agents must be able to compare all options and have a preference or be indifferent between them. Ellsberg's paradox has inspired alternative decision theories that can accommodate ambiguity aversion, including maximum expected utility theory, where agents consider multiple possible probability distributions consistent with their knowledge and choose the action that maximizes expected utility under the worst-case distribution, effectively being pessimistic about ambiguity, and Choquet expected utility theory, where probabilities are replaced with capacities that need not be additive, allowing for a richer representation of uncertainty, and multiple priors models, where agents maintain a set of probability distributions rather than a single prior and use decision rules that reflect their attitudes toward this multiplicity. The paradox also connects to debates about rationality and the normative status of decision-theoretic axioms. Some argue that the Ellsberg preferences are irrational, that they reflect cognitive biases or errors in reasoning, and that ideal rational agents would not exhibit ambiguity aversion, would assign consistent subjective probabilities and maximize expected utility, while others argue that ambiguity aversion is perfectly rational, that it reflects a reasonable response to ignorance, that known risks are genuinely different from unknown risks, and that the axioms of expected utility theory, while mathematically elegant, do not capture all aspects of rational decision-making. The paradox has practical implications for economics and finance, because ambiguity aversion affects how people make decisions under uncertainty, how they invest in markets where probabilities are unknown, how they value insurance and options, how they respond to new technologies with uncertain risks. And understanding ambiguity aversion helps explain behaviors that seem puzzling from a standard expected utility perspective, such as the home bias in portfolio choice, where investors prefer domestic assets over foreign assets even when expected returns are higher abroad, and the equity premium puzzle, where the observed returns on stocks are much higher than on bonds, suggesting that investors demand large premiums for bearing ambiguous risks. The urn sits on the table, 90 balls inside, 30 red and 60 mixed, and you must choose, and the choices seem reasonable, seem to reflect a natural caution about the unknown, but the pattern of choices violates the axioms of rational decision theory, reveals a preference structure that cannot be represented by subjective probabilities, and the paradox forces a choice: either accept that the preferences are irrational and should be corrected, or accept that the theory is incomplete and should be extended, and neither option is comfortable. Neither satisfies the desire for a simple unified theory of rational choice. And so the Ellsberg paradox remains, a challenge to orthodoxy, a puzzle that resists easy resolution, a demonstration that human decision-making is more complex than the elegant mathematics of expected utility suggests. and the ambiguity persists. The unknown proportions of black and yellow remain unknown, and we choose as we must, preferring the known to the unknown, preferring certainty to ambiguity, and the theory struggles to accommodate this preference, struggles to explain why it should be rational or how it can be consistent, and the paradox endures, unsolved, unresolved, a permanent thorn in the side of decision theory. A reminder that rationality is contested, that formal models capture some aspects of decision-making but not all, and that the gap between theory and behaviour, between what axioms demand and what people do, may reflect not irrationality, but the inadequacy of the axioms themselves. And the urn waits, the balls wait, the choice waits, and we must decide, knowing some probabilities but not others. And the decision reveals something about us, about how we value knowledge and fear ignorance, about whether ambiguity is just another form of risk or something fundamentally different. And the paradox lingers, unresolved, unsettled, a puzzle that decision theory has not yet tamed. The flicker of freedom, the tiny space where choice still lives. A philosopher examines Frankfurt's counterexamples, the cases where a person acts on their own but could not have done otherwise because an intervener would have prevented any alternative. And Frankfurt argues these cases show that responsibility does not require the ability to do otherwise, that alternate possibilities are not necessary for free will. But philosopher Robert Kane and others have identified something Frankfurt missed, a detail in the structure of the cases that preserves a tiny alternative, a flicker of freedom, a moment where the person could have begun to choose differently before the intervener stopped them. And this flicker, though tiny, though insufficient to constitute full alternative action, might be enough to ground responsibility, might show that Frankfurt's cases do not actually eliminate alternatives, but only limit them. And if the flicker is necessary for responsibility, then the principle of alternate possibilities survives. Survives, in modified form, requires not robust alternatives, but only minimal alternatives, only flickers. And this is the flicker of freedom argument, the observation that Frankfurt cases contain residual alternatives, tiny spaces where choice still operates. And these flickers might be necessary and sufficient for responsibility. And the debate about Frankfurt cases becomes a debate about whether flickers matter, whether tiny alternatives count, whether responsibility requires robust alternatives or only minimal ones. And this debate has generated extensive literature, has forced refinement of Frankfurt's argument, has led to increasingly complex thought experiments designed to eliminate even flickers. And the question remains whether true flicker-free cases are possible, whether alternatives can be completely eliminated while responsibility is preserved, and the flicker of freedom persists as a challenge to Frankfurt's argument, as a defense of the principle of alternate possibilities, as a last stand for the view that responsibility requires alternatives. Imagine a Frankfurt case carefully. Jones is about to decide whether to vote for candidate A or candidate B, and Black, the intervener, has placed a device in Jones's brain that monitors his neural activity, and the device can detect which way Jones will decide before Jones becomes conscious of his decision, can detect the neural precursors of choosing B, and if the device detects these precursors, it will intervene, will alter Jones's brain to make him decide to vote for A instead. But if Jones is going to decide on his own to vote for A, then the device does nothing, remains dormant, and now suppose Jones decides on his own to vote for A. The device detects no precursors of choosing B because there are none. Jones was always going to choose A on his own, and so the device does nothing, and Jones votes for A based on his own decision. And Frankfurt says Jones is responsible, even though he could not have done otherwise, because if he had started to choose B, the device would have intervened. And so Jones could not have voted for B, had no alternative, and yet Frankfurt says Jones is responsible, because he acted on his own, and the device played no role. But now consider the flicker. There is a moment, however brief, before the device detects that Jones is choosing B, before the device can intervene, and in that moment, Jones could have begun to choose differently, could have initiated the neural precursors that would have triggered intervention, and this moment is a genuine alternative. Is something Jones could have done differently, even though if he had done it, the device would have stopped him from completing the alternative choice. And so there is an alternative. There is something Jones could have done otherwise, namely, begin to choose B. And this alternative, though tiny, though incomplete, is a flicker of freedom. And the question is whether this flicker is sufficient to ground responsibility, whether the ability to begin an alternative is enough even if the ability to complete it is absent. Visualize freedom as coming in degrees. At one end is robust freedom, the full ability to choose and complete any available alternative. At the other end is no freedom, no alternatives whatsoever. And flickers are near the no freedom end, but not quite at it. Are minimal alternatives, are the ability to begin alternatives, even if not to complete them. And the debate is whether this minimal freedom is sufficient for responsibility, whether flickers count or whether only robust alternatives matter. And source theorists who follow Frankfurt say flickers do not matter, say that what matters for responsibility is not alternatives but source, whether the action flows from the agent's own will. And flicker theorists who defend alternate possibilities say flickers do matter, say that responsibility requires some alternative, even if minimal, even if only a flicker. Frankfurt responded to the flicker objection by constructing more sophisticated cases, blockage cases, where the intervener does not wait for precursors but intervenes earlier, or cases where the intervener controls the entire deliberative process, ensures that only one alternative is genuinely possible psychologically. And these refined cases attempt to eliminate even flickers, attempt to create scenarios where no alternative exists at any point, not even the alternative of beginning to choose differently. And if such flicker-free cases are possible, if they preserve responsibility, then Frankfurt's argument succeeds, shows that responsibility does not require alternatives, and the principle of alternate possibilities is refuted. But critics argue that truly flicker-free cases are impossible, that any case detailed enough to eliminate all flickers will either eliminate responsibility along with alternatives, or will preserve subtle flickers that defenders miss. And this back and forth, this attempt to construct and critique flicker-free cases, has dominated discussions of Frankfurt cases for decades, has generated increasingly technical papers, increasingly complex scenarios, and no consensus has emerged, and both sides claim victory, claim that the cases support their view, and the debate continues. The flicker of freedom also connects to debates about determinism and sourcehood, because if determinism is true, then flickers might not exist, might themselves be eliminated by deterministic causation, and so the flicker debate might ultimately depend on whether determinism is true, whether quantum indeterminacy provides space for genuine alternatives. And this makes the debate about flickers part of the larger debate about free will and determinism, about whether compatibilism or incompatibilism is correct. One response to the flicker argument accepts that flickers exist in Frankfurt cases, but denies that flickers ground responsibility, argues that the ability to begin an alternative that would immediately be stopped is not the kind of ability that matters for responsibility, is not genuine control, is not enough to make the action truly up to the agent, and responsibility requires more than flickers, requires robust alternatives, or requires source without alternatives. And flickers are too weak to do the work that alternate possibilities theorists need them to do. And Frankfurt's argument succeeds despite the flickers, because flickers are irrelevant to responsibility. Another response embraces flickers, argues that they show Frankfurt cases fail, show that alternatives are preserved, and this response modifies the principle of alternate possibilities to say that responsibility requires alternatives, but these alternatives need not be robust, need only be flickers, need only be the ability to begin alternatives even if not to complete them. And this modified principle is immune to Frankfurt's argument because Frankfurt cases contain flickers, and flicker-free cases either do not exist or do not preserve responsibility. And so the principle of alternate possibilities survives in modified form, survives as the principle that responsibility requires. At least flickers of freedom requires some alternative possibilities, however minimal. The flicker debate also raises questions about what counts as an alternative, about how much control is required for something to be a genuine alternative, and these questions are central to understanding freedom, to specifying what free will requires. And the flicker debate, though technical, though focused on detailed cases, ultimately concerns fundamental issues about agency, control, and responsibility. And the debate has been productive, has forced clarification of concepts, has revealed complexity in notions that seemed simple, and whether flickers matter, whether they ground responsibility or are irrelevant, remains disputed, remains one of the many unresolved issues in the free will debate. Jones votes, the device does nothing, and somewhere in the process there is or is not a flicker, a moment where Jones could have begun differently, a tiny alternative that would have triggered intervention. And whether this flicker exists and whether it matters determine whether Frankfurt's argument succeeds. Whether responsibility requires alternatives and the flicker of freedom remains, tiny but potentially crucial, a last gasp of alternate possibilities in cases designed to eliminate them. And the debate continues, philosophers constructing ever more sophisticated cases, critics finding ever more subtle flickers, and the question persists, do flickers matter? Are tiny alternatives enough for responsibility? Or is responsibility about source, not alternatives? About where choices come from, not what else could have been chosen? And the flicker flickers, at the edge of possibility, barely existing, possibly necessary, and the debate around it endures. The garden of forking paths where every choice splits reality. A writer imagines time as a garden of forking paths, a labyrinth where each decision creates a branching, where reality splits into multiple futures, one for each possible choice, and this image captures something deep about how we experience decision-making. We stand at forks, at moments where multiple paths lie ahead, and we choose which path to take. And unchosen paths remain as real possibilities, as roads not taken, and this multiplicity of possibilities, this forking structure of time, seems essential to freedom, seems to be what makes choice meaningful, because choosing requires alternatives, requires that other options be genuinely possible, genuinely available, and yet physics tells a different story, tells us that reality does not actually fork, that there is one actual future, one path that will be taken, and the other paths are mere possibilities, unreal, never actualized, and this creates tension between the subjective experience of forking paths and the objective reality of a single actual future. And this tension is what the garden of forking paths represents. The conflict between the branching structure we experience and the linear structure physics describes. And resolving this tension requires understanding what possibilities are, whether they are real or merely epistemic, whether the garden of forking paths is a feature of reality or only of our ignorance. And this is the garden of forking paths problem, the question of how to reconcile freedom, which seems to require genuine alternatives, with determinism, which says only one future is possible. Imagine standing at a fork, two paths before you, and you must choose which to take. And both paths seem open, seem available, seem like real options, and you deliberate, consider reasons for each path, weigh consequences, and make a decision. And as you walk down the chosen path, you look back at the fork and see the unchosen path receding behind you. And that path represents what could have been, what might have happened. And this counterfactual, this alternative possibility seems essential to the meaning of your choice. Because if the unchosen path was never really possible, if you were always going to choose as you did, then the deliberation seems pointless, seems like theatre, and the choice seems less significant, less truly yours. And yet determinism says the unchosen path was never really possible, was never going to be actualized, was only possible in your ignorance of which path you would take. And the garden of forking paths is a map of ignorance, not a map of reality. And the paths that seem to fork actually do not actually collapse to a single trajectory determined by past and laws. The garden of forking paths is a metaphor from Jorge Luis Borges, from his story about a novel that represents time as forking, where every possible future exists in parallel, where the protagonist makes different choices in different branches, and all branches are real, all a part of the same story. And Borges uses this to explore ideas about time and possibility and narrative, and philosophers have adopted the metaphor to represent the libertarian view of free will. The view that when we make choices, reality genuinely branches, multiple futures exist, and our choice determines which branch becomes actual. And this contrasts with the compatibilist view, where the garden does not actually fork, where only one future was ever possible. And deliberation is about discovering which future is actual, rather than creating which future is actual. Visualize the metaphor more precisely. At each moment of choice, the timeline splits. One branch for voting for candidate A, and another for voting for candidate B. And both branches are real. Both exist as genuine possibilities, and the agent's choice makes one branch actual, and the other merely counterfactual. And if this picture is correct, then free will is preserved, because genuine alternatives existed. But if this picture is wrong, if only one branch is real, and the other is merely imagined, then free will is threatened. Then the agent never really had alternatives, never really chose between real possibilities, only discovered which possibility was actual all along. The garden of forking paths connects to debates about the metaphysics of time, about whether the future is open or closed, whether future contingents have truth values, whether statements about what will happen tomorrow are true or false now, or are neither true nor false until tomorrow arrives. And open future theorists say the future is genuinely open, genuinely indeterminate. The garden genuinely forks, and multiple futures are possible, and closed future theorists say the future is already determined, already fixed, only one future is possible, and the garden does not really fork, only appears to fork from our limited perspective. One response to the garden of forking paths embraces the branching metaphor, adopts the growing block theory of time, where the past and present are real, and the future is not yet real, is open, is genuinely undetermined. And as time progresses, the future becomes present, and then past, and the timeline grows. And at moments of free choice, the timeline branches, multiple futures become actualized, and libertarian free will is preserved. But critics argue that this picture is inconsistent with physics, with relativity, which says that simultaneity is relative, that there is no objective present moment, and the growing block theory cannot be reconciled with relativity. And so, the garden of forking paths cannot be real, is only a convenient fiction. Another response denies the branching, accepts that only one future is real, and argues that free will does not require genuine branching, does not require that unchosen alternatives be real, but only requires that the agent's choice be the determining factor in which future is actualized. And as long as the agent's deliberation and decision play a causal role, as long as the action flows from the agent's own reasons and desires, the agent is free, and the garden of forking paths is an epistemic representation, a map of what might happen from the agent's perspective, but not a metaphysical reality. And this compatibilist response preserves free will without requiring genuine metaphysical branching. A third response appeals to the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, where every quantum measurement causes the universe to split into multiple branches, one for each possible outcome, and all branches are real. all exist in a vast multiverse, and human choices might involve quantum processes, might cause branching at the quantum level. And so the Garden of Forking Paths is literally real, is part of the structure of quantum reality, and every choice you make creates multiple versions of you in different branches, and free will is preserved because genuine branching occurs. Though this response raises questions about which branch is you, about personal identity across branches, about whether it matters that other branches exist if you can never observe them or interact with them. The Garden of Forking Paths also appears in discussions of regret and counterfactuals, because when we regret choices, we imagine the path not taken, imagine how things would have been if we had chosen differently. And this imagining treats the unchosen path as a real possibility, as something that could have happened. And the question is whether this treatment is accurate, whether the unchosen path was genuinely possible, or was only possible in our imagination, only possible relative to our ignorance. And if only imaginary, then regret is irrational, is lamenting something that could never have been. And if genuinely possible, then regret is rational, is lamenting a real alternative that was available but not chosen. The writer walks through the garden, sees the paths forking ahead, sees the labyrinth of possibilities, and each fork represents a choice, a moment where the future is open, where alternatives exist, and the writer chooses again and again, and each choice closes off paths, eliminates possibilities, and the unchosen paths remain behind, fading into counterfactual space. And whether these unchosen paths are real, whether they exist somewhere in quantum multiverse or only in imagination, determines whether the Garden of Forking Paths is a true picture of reality or only a useful metaphor. And the question remains open, remains disputed, and the garden remains branching or not branching, forking or merely appearing to fork. And we walk through it, choosing paths, deliberating at forks, and whether the alternatives are real or illusory. Whether the garden genuinely branches or only seems to, shapes how we understand freedom, how we interpret choice, and whether determinism eliminates the garden or merely reveals that it never really forked. And the metaphor endures, beautiful and problematic, a representation of how choice feels from the inside, even if not how choice is from the outside. And the Garden of Forking Paths remains a permanent fixture in discussions of free will, a vivid image that captures the experience of agency, even as physics and metaphysics question whether the image corresponds to reality. The grandfather paradox. Time travel has long been a staple of science fiction, a dream of visiting the past or glimpsing the future. But woven into this fantasy is a logical nightmare that has haunted physicists and philosophers alike. And this is the grandfather paradox, a thought experiment that questions whether travelling backward in time could ever be possible without creating contradictions that tear reality apart. Imagine a person who builds a time machine and travels back to a point before their own birth, and while in the past this person encounters their grandfather as a young man, before he has met the traveller's grandmother, before any children have been conceived. And in a moment of recklessness or malice or accident, the time traveller kills their grandfather. The question that follows is immediate and devastating. If the grandfather dies before fathering any children, then the time traveller's parent is never born. And if the parent is never born, then the time traveller is never born. And if the time traveller is never born, then no one travels back in time to kill the grandfather, which means the grandfather lives, which means the parent is born, which means the time traveller is born, which means someone does travel back in time to kill the grandfather, and the loop closes, a perfect circle of cause and effect that devours itself. The paradox suggests that backward time travel, if possible, would permit changes to the past that erase their own causes, creating logical contradictions that seem to violate the basic structure of causality, the idea that causes precede effects, that events unfold in a coherent sequence rather than collapsing into impossible tangles. Some physicists argue that the paradox proves time travel to the past is impossible, that the laws of physics must somehow prevent any action that would create a causal loop or alter history in a way that leads to contradiction. And this idea is formalized in the Novikov self-consistency principle, which states that if time travel is possible, then only self-consistent timelines can occur, meaning the time traveler would find themselves unable to kill their grandfather. No matter how hard they tried, the gun would jam, the traveler would hesitate, something would always intervene to preserve consistency. Others propose the many worlds interpretation, suggesting that when the time traveler kills their grandfather, they create a branching timeline, a parallel universe where the grandfather dies and the traveler is never born in that branch, while in the original timeline, everything continues as before. And so no true paradox arises because the timelines never contradict each other. They simply diverge. Still others embrace the idea that time is not a single linear path, but a more complex structure, a block universe where past, present, and future all exist simultaneously, and where time travel is simply movement through a fixed four-dimensional landscape. And in such a universe, the grandfather was always killed by the time traveler. The timeline was always that way. There is no changing of history because history is immutable. All events, including the time travel, are already written into the fabric of space-time. The paradox also raises questions about identity and causation, about what it means to exist, about whether effects can precede their causes, and whether the universe permits contradictions or whether reality itself enforces logical consistency as a fundamental law. The grandfather paradox remains one of the most vivid illustrations of the conceptual challenges posed by backward causation, a puzzle that blends physics with metaphysics, science with philosophy, and that forces anyone dreaming of time travel to confront the possibility that the past, once written, cannot be rewritten without unraveling the very threads that make existence coherent. The Fermi paradox. Where is everybody in this crowded universe? The Milky Way galaxy contains hundreds of billions of stars, many with planets, and our galaxy is one of hundreds of billions of galaxies in the observable universe. An Earth formed about 4.5 billion years ago, relatively late in cosmic history, and life emerged within 1 billion years, and intelligence and technology developed recently. And these facts suggest that Earth is not special, that the conditions that led to life here should occur elsewhere, and if even a tiny fraction of planets develop intelligent civilizations, and if even a small percentage of those civilizations develop technology capable of space travel or interstellar communication, then the galaxy should be teeming with evidence of alien intelligence. We should see their radio signals, their spacecraft, their structures, their influence on stars and planets, and yet we see nothing, hear nothing, find no evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence despite decades of searching, despite scanning the skies with radio telescopes, despite analysing thousands of exoplanets. And this silence, this absence of evidence, is the Fermi paradox, named after physicist Enrico Fermi, who reportedly asked during a lunch conversation in 1950, "Where is everybody?" And this question, simple and childlike, conceals one of the deepest puzzles in science, the question of whether we are alone in the universe, or whether alien civilizations exist but remain undetected for reasons we do not yet understand. The paradox can be stated more precisely through the Drake equation, an attempt to estimate the number of communicating civilizations in our galaxy. The equation multiplies together several factors: the rate of star formation, the fraction of stars with planets, the number of habitable planets per star system, the fraction of habitable planets where life emerges, the fraction of life-bearing planets where intelligence evolves, the fraction of intelligent species that develop technology, and the lifetime of technological civilizations. And depending on the values assigned to these factors, the equation predicts anywhere from 0 civilizations besides us to millions, and optimistic estimates suggests thousands or millions of alien civilizations should exist in our galaxy alone. And over billions of years, some of these civilizations should have spread through the galaxy, colonizing stars, building structures, leaving traces, and yet we see nothing. And this gap between expectation and observation is the Fermi paradox. Various explanations have been proposed, grouped into several categories. One possibility is that intelligent life is extraordinarily rare, that one or more factors in the Drake equation is much smaller than optimistic estimates suggest. Perhaps the emergence of life is a rare event. Perhaps the evolution of complex multicellular organisms requires unlikely coincidences. Perhaps intelligence is not an inevitable outcome of evolution, but a fluke that happened once on Earth and nowhere else. And if intelligence is sufficiently rare, then perhaps we are the first or among the first civilizations in the galaxy, and the silence is explained by our being early arrivals, alone for now, but perhaps not forever. Another category of explanations invokes the Great Filter, a hypothetical barrier that prevents civilizations from reaching the stage where they are detectable across interstellar distances. And the filter could be in our past, something that makes the emergence of intelligence extremely difficult, in which case humanity has passed the filter and the future is open, or the filter could be in our future, a challenge that civilizations face and almost always fail. Perhaps self-destruction through war or environmental collapse, perhaps technological stagnation, perhaps a transition that seems likely but proves fatal. And if the great filter lies ahead, then our survival is not guaranteed, and the silence of the cosmos is ominous, a warning that intelligence tends toward extinction. A third category suggests that civilizations exist but remain undetected for various reasons. Perhaps they communicate using technologies we have not discovered. Perhaps they deliberately hide to avoid contact with younger civilizations. Perhaps they exist in forms we would not recognize as life or intelligence. Perhaps they transcend physical form and migrate into cyberspace or other dimensions. Or perhaps the distances and timescales involved are so vast that civilizations exist but are separated by millions of light years and billions of years, arising and falling in isolation, never overlapping in space and time, and so contact is impossible. Not because civilizations do not exist, but because the universe is too big and time is too long. Visualize the galaxy as a vast ocean, and civilizations as islands, separated by light years of empty space, and each island has a brief window of technological activity, a few thousand years perhaps, before collapse or transformation, and the ocean is so large and the windows so brief that the probability of two civilizations existing simultaneously within communication range is vanishingly small. And so each civilization looks out, sees emptiness, hears silence, and concludes it is alone. And yet across the galaxy and across time many such civilizations exist, but they never meet, never communicate, never know each other, and the Fermi paradox is resolved not by the absence of life, but by the impossibility of contact. Another explanation, more speculative, suggests that we are living in a simulation, that the observable universe is a computational construct created by an advanced civilization, and the silence is programmed. No other civilizations are simulated because the creators are interested only in studying us, or because simulating multiple civilizations is too computationally expensive. And this explanation, while unfalsifiable, is logically possible and provides a clean resolution to the paradox, though it raises new questions about the nature of the simulators and their purposes. The Fermi paradox has practical implications for the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, for SETI programs that scan the skies for radio signals, for astrobiology missions that search for life on Mars or the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, and for the question of whether humanity should attempt to contact alien civilizations or remain silent. Because if the great filter lies ahead, if civilizations typically self-destruct or face existential dangers, then advertising our presence might be risky, might attract attention from hostile or indifferent intelligences, and the silence of the cosmos might be a survival strategy, a lesson learned by civilizations that survive, and if so, then broadcasting our existence might be foolish, might mark us for extinction or exploitation. The paradox also touches on philosophy and the meaning of human existence, because if we are alone, if no other intelligence exists anywhere in the observable universe, then humanity carries a unique responsibility. We are the universe's only way of understanding itself, the only conscious observers, the only beings capable of science and art and love, and the future of consciousness depends on us, on whether we survive and spread. And this realization, far from being comforting, is terrifying, because it places an enormous burden on a species that has barely begun to leave its home planet. And if we fail, if we destroy ourselves, the universe returns to darkness, to unconsciousness, to a vast emptiness where stars burn and galaxies collide. But no one watches, no one cares, no one knows. The stars shine silent and distant, and we listen, and we hear nothing, and the silence stretches across billions of light years, across billions of years, and Fermi's question echoes, where is everybody? Where are the aliens? Where are the civilizations that should exist, that must exist, that the numbers say should exist, and the answer does not come? And the paradox remains unresolved, pressing, urgent, a question that haunts astronomers and philosophers, a mystery that drives the search for life beyond Earth, and a reminder that despite all our knowledge, despite all our telescopes and equations, we do not know whether we are alone or whether the universe teems with life. And the silence, profound and unbroken, waits, and we wonder and we search, and the paradox persists. The EPR paradox, when particles know what their partners are doing. Two particles are created together in a quantum process, perhaps two photons emitted from a single atom, or two electrons produced in a pair, and these particles fly apart in opposite directions, travelling far from each other, perhaps to opposite ends of a laboratory, or even to different planets. And quantum mechanics predicts that these particles remain connected, entangled, in a way that defies classical intuition, because measuring a property of one particle instantly affects the other particle, no matter how far apart they are, and the measurement outcomes are correlated in ways that cannot be explained by assuming each particle carried definite properties from the beginning. And this is the EPR paradox, named after Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen, who presented it in 1935 as an argument that quantum mechanics is incomplete, that there must be hidden variables, additional information not captured by the quantum wave function that determines the outcomes of measurements and explains the correlations without requiring instantaneous action at a distance. Imagine the scenario more concretely. Two particles are entangled such that they have opposite spins. If one is measured to have spin up, then the other will definitely be measured to have spin down, and vice versa. And this correlation is perfect, 100%, whenever both particles are measured along the same axis. And before measurement, quantum mechanics describes each particle as being in a superposition of spin up and spin down, neither definite. And the two particles together are described by an entangled state that cannot be factored into separate descriptions of each particle. The state is inherently joint, and when one particle is measured and found to be spin up, the other particle's state immediately becomes spin down, even if the two particles are light years apart. And this instantaneous correlation troubled Einstein, who called it spooky action at a distance, and argued that it violated the principle of locality, the idea that physical influences cannot travel faster than light, that distant events cannot have immediate effects. Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen proposed that quantum mechanics is incomplete, that each particle must carry hidden information, hidden variables that determine what the measurement outcomes will be, and these hidden variables are fixed at the moment the particles are created, And so when the particles are measured later, the outcomes are determined by these pre-existing properties, not by any instantaneous influence. And the correlation between the particles is explained by the fact that they started with correlated hidden variables, like two coins that were both set to heads when they left your hand and remain heads as they fly through the air. And when you look at them later, you find them both showing heads. And this correlation does not require any spooky action, just common initial conditions. And EPR argued that quantum mechanics, which does not include these hidden variables, gives an incomplete description of reality. For decades, the EPR argument was a philosophical debate, a question about interpretation and the nature of quantum mechanics. But in 1964, physicist John Bell proved a theorem that transformed the debate into an experimental question. Bell showed that any theory based on local hidden variables, any theory where measurement outcomes are determined by pre-existing properties and where influences travel at or below the speed of light, must satisfy certain mathematical inequalities, now called Bell inequalities, and these inequalities place limits on how strongly the measurement outcomes of two distant particles can be correlated. And Bell showed that quantum mechanics predicts correlations that violate these inequalities, that quantum correlations are stronger than any local hidden variable theory can produce. And so by performing experiments and measuring the correlations, one can test whether nature obeys the Bell inequalities, and if the inequalities are violated, then local hidden variables are ruled out, and quantum mechanics, with its spooky action at a distance, is vindicated. Experiments have been performed many times with increasing sophistication and precision, closing various loopholes, and the results consistently show violations of Bell inequalities, strong correlations that match quantum mechanical predictions, and rule out local hidden variable theories. And so nature does not obey locality in the way Einstein wanted. The particles really are entangled, and measuring one really does instantaneously affect the other. And this is now an established experimental fact, one of the most thoroughly tested predictions in physics, and the EPR paradox has been resolved in favour of quantum mechanics against Einstein's intuitions, though the philosophical implications remain deeply puzzling. The paradox forces a choice between giving up locality or giving up realism, the idea that physical properties have definite values independent of measurement, and most interpretations of quantum mechanics give up realism, accepting that particles do not have definite spin values until measured, that the spin only becomes definite through the act of measurement, and the entanglement means that the two particles are not independent. They form a single quantum system even when separated by vast distances, and measuring one particle provides information about the system as a whole, and this information is reflected in the state of the other particle. But this does not allow faster-than-light communication, because the measurement outcomes are random. Neither particle can control what value it will be measured to have, and so no message can be sent. Only correlations can be observed after the fact by comparing measurement records. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics, like Bohmian mechanics, preserve realism by giving up locality, introducing non-local hidden variables that allow instantaneous influences, pilot waves that guide particles in ways that depend on the entire configuration of the universe. And these theories reproduce the predictions of quantum mechanics and are empirically equivalent, but they are non-local. They violate Einstein's principle that influences cannot propagate faster than light. And most physicists find this cost too high, prefer to accept that realism must be given up, that particles do not have definite properties until measured. Visualize the two entangled particles flying apart, one heading left and one heading right, and they are described by a single wave function, an entangled state that says, if left is up, then right is down, and if left is down, then right is up, but neither is definite until measured. And now imagine measuring the left particle and finding it spin up, and at that instant, even though the right particle is far away, its state changes. It becomes definitely spin down, And if someone measures the right particle immediately after, they will definitely find spin down. And this correlation holds no matter how far apart the particles are, no matter how quickly the measurements are performed, as long as they are performed along the same axis. And this instantaneous correlation cannot be explained by assuming the particles carry definite spins from the beginning. Bell's theorem proves that, and so the correlation is genuinely quantum, genuinely non-local, genuinely spooky. And yet it does not allow signaling, does not allow information to be sent faster than light, because the outcomes are random and cannot be controlled. The EPR paradox stands as one of the deepest puzzles in quantum mechanics, a paradox that led to Bell's theorem, to decades of experimental tests, to the confirmation of quantum non-locality, and to ongoing debates about what quantum mechanics means, about whether reality is fundamentally non-local, about whether measurement is a special process or an ordinary interaction, about whether consciousness plays a role, about whether the universe splits into branches or whether hidden variables exist beyond our current theories, and none of these questions has a settled answer. Different physicists and philosophers hold different views, and the EPR paradox remains a touchstone, a thought experiment that crystallizes the central mysteries of quantum theory. And Einstein's discomfort with spooky action at a distance, his belief that quantum mechanics must be incomplete, has been answered by experiment. Nature really is spooky. Particles really are entangled. Measurements really do have instantaneous non-local effects. And this is not a failure of the theory, but a feature of reality, a feature that defies classical intuition and forces us to accept that the quantum world operates according to rules that seem impossible, that violate locality, that create correlations stronger than any classical mechanism can produce. And the paradox endures, not as an unsolved problem, but as a solved problem with an unsettling answer. And the particles fly apart, entangled forever, connected by invisible quantum threads, and measuring one affects the other instantly, across any distance, and the universe is non-local. And the EPR paradox, intended to show that quantum mechanics is incomplete, instead revealed that nature is stranger than Einstein imagined. The diamond water paradox, why necessities are cheap and luxuries expensive. An economist observes that water is essential for life, is necessary for survival, is the most useful substance, and yet water is cheap, is almost free, costs nearly nothing in most places, while diamonds are useless for survival, are decorative luxuries, serve no biological function, and yet diamonds are expensive, cost fortunes, are among the most valuable commodities. And this seems paradoxical, seems to contradict the principle that value should reflect usefulness, that prices should correspond to importance. And this is the diamond water paradox, first discussed by Adam Smith, a puzzle about why necessities are cheap and luxuries expensive, why things essential for life have low prices while things irrelevant to survival have high prices. And the paradox challenged early economic thinking, challenged the labour theory of value, which said that prices reflect the amount of labour required to produce goods. And the paradox remained unresolved until marginal utility theory was developed, until economists realised that value depends not on total utility, but on marginal utility, not on the usefulness of the entire quantity available, but on the usefulness of one additional unit. And water has high total utility. Life depends on it, but low marginal utility because we have abundant water, and one more gallon provides little additional benefit, while diamonds have low total utility but high marginal utility because diamonds are scarce, and one more diamond provides significant additional satisfaction to those who value them. And this insight resolved the paradox, showed that prices reflect scarcity and marginal benefit rather than total importance. And the diamond water paradox became a teaching example, became the canonical illustration of the difference between total and marginal value. Imagine your situation regarding water. You have access to abundant water, can drink whenever you want, can shower, can water plants, and the first glass of water each day is enormously valuable. Prevents dehydration, sustains life, but by the time you've consumed several gallons, the marginal value of additional water is nearly zero. Additional water provides almost no benefit, and since price reflects the value of the marginal unit, the value of one more gallon, and since that marginal value is nearly zero, price is nearly zero, is very low, and this explains why water is cheap despite being essential. Because the marginal unit is not very valuable, because we have so much water that additional water is worth little. And now consider diamonds. You probably have no diamonds or very few, and the first diamond you acquire has significant value, provides aesthetic pleasure, provides status, and since diamonds are scarce, since you have few or none, the marginal value of an additional diamond is high. And since price reflects marginal value, price is high. And this explains why diamonds are expensive despite being non-essential. Because the marginal unit is very valuable. Because diamonds are scarce and additional, diamonds provide significant benefit to those who value them. The diamond water paradox demonstrates the importance of distinguishing total utility from marginal utility, shows that these can diverge dramatically, that goods with high total utility can have low marginal utility, and vice versa. And this distinction is fundamental to microeconomics, is the basis for understanding consumer choice, for deriving demand curves, for analysing how people allocate scarce resources, and marginal thinking about the value of additional units rather than the value of entire categories, is essential for economic reasoning. And the paradox illustrates why marginal thinking matters, why it produces different conclusions than total thinking, and resolving the paradox required economists to shift from thinking about total value to thinking about marginal value, to recognise that prices are determined at the margin, by the last unit exchanged, not by the average or total units. Visualise the marginal utility curves for water and diamonds. The marginal utility of water is high for the first units, the first gallons that prevent dehydration, but declines rapidly as consumption increases, as basic needs are satisfied, and at the quantity consumed, the marginal utility is low, is near zero, and price equals this low marginal utility, while the marginal utility of diamonds is high even at low quantities, because diamonds are scarce, because even wealthy people have relatively few diamonds, and at the quantity consumed the marginal utility remains high, and price equals this high marginal utility. And this graphical representation makes the resolution clear, makes it visible that prices reflect marginal, not total utility, and the paradox dissolves once the distinction is understood. One implication of the diamond water paradox is about consumer surplus, the difference between what consumers would be willing to pay for all units and what they actually pay. And consumer surplus for water is enormous, is the difference between the life-saving value of the first units and the near-zero price paid, and consumers gain vastly more from water than they pay for it. While consumer surplus for diamonds is small, buyers pay prices close to their willingness to pay, and this shows that market prices do not reflect total value to consumers, do not capture the full benefit people receive, and the difference is consumer surplus is the unmeasured benefit. And understanding this helps explain why markets are beneficial, why trade creates value, because both buyers and sellers typically gain surplus, gain benefit beyond what they pay or receive. Another implication concerns necessity goods and luxury goods more generally. The paradox illustrates that necessities tend to be cheap, tend to have low prices relative to their importance, because necessities are typically abundant or because demand saturates quickly, because once basic needs are satisfied, marginal utility declines, while luxuries tend to be expensive, tend to have high prices relative to their importance, because luxuries are scarce or because demand does not saturate, because the wealthy always want more luxuries, and this pattern has implications for taxation. For understanding that taxing necessities is regressive, hits the poor harder, while taxing luxuries is progressive, hits the wealthy harder, And the paradox helps explain why economists typically advocate luxury taxes over necessity taxes, why sin taxes on non-essential goods are more acceptable than food taxes. The paradox also appears in discussions about water scarcity because the resolution depends on water being abundant, depends on marginal utility being low, but in regions where water is scarce, the marginal utility of water rises dramatically, and prices should rise correspondingly, should reflect scarcity. And this suggests that in water-scarce regions, water should be expensive, should be priced to encourage conservation, to allocate scarce supplies efficiently, but such pricing is controversial, is seen as making a necessity unaffordable. And this creates political tension, creates conflict between economic efficiency, which requires high prices for scarce water, and social justice, which requires affordable water, and resolving this tension requires subsidies or tiered pricing or other interventions. And the paradox illuminates the trade-offs involved. Some argue that the diamond water paradox is not fully resolved, that even marginal utility theory leaves puzzles because why do diamonds have high marginal utility? Why do people value diamonds? And the answer involves signaling, involves conspicuous consumption, involves diamonds serving as status symbols. And this is a different kind of value, is social rather than intrinsic. And understanding diamond value requires understanding social dynamics, understanding how luxuries signal wealth, how scarcity creates desirability, and this extends the resolution, shows that marginal utility can reflect social as well as physical properties, can reflect symbolic meaning as well as functional use. The paradox also connects to debates about labor theory of value, because Marx used labor theory, argued that value reflects socially necessary labor time, and the diamond water paradox is often seen as refuting labor theory, as showing that prices do not simply reflect labor inputs, because water requires little labor per gallon, but is essential, while diamonds require more labor but are luxury. But defenders of labor theory respond that the paradox misunderstands their theory, that labor theory concerns exchange value, not use value, concerns prices, not total utility, and that labor theory can accommodate the paradox by recognizing that scarcity affects prices, that supply and demand matter, and this debate continues, shows that the paradox remains relevant for understanding competing theories of value. Water flows abundantly, is drunk freely, costs almost nothing, and diamonds sit in vaults, are purchased rarely, cost fortunes, and the paradox stands, necessity is cheap and luxury expensive. Total utility diverges from price, and the resolution comes through marginal thinking, through recognizing that prices reflect the value of additional units, not the value of all units, through understanding that scarcity matters, that abundance reduces marginal value, and the diamond water paradox endures as one of the classic examples in economics, as the teaching tool for introducing marginal utility, as the illustration of why economic thinking requires focusing on the margin, on incremental changes, on additional units, and the paradox remains, resolved but instructive, showing that value is context-dependent, is determined by scarcity and marginal benefit, and prices reflect the margin, not the total, and understanding this is fundamental to economic reasoning. The false belief paradox. Young children, typically before the age of 4 or 5, exhibit a curious cognitive limitation. They struggle to understand that other people can hold beliefs that differ from reality, that someone can believe something false, and this limitation is revealed through false belief tasks, experimental scenarios designed to test whether children can represent the mental states of others, can understand that beliefs are representations that can be accurate or inaccurate, and the classic version involves a character named Maxie who places chocolate in a cupboard and then leaves the room. And while Maxie is gone, his mother moves the chocolate to a drawer. And when Maxie returns, children are asked where Maxie will look for the chocolate. And young children, those who have not yet developed what psychologists call theory of mind, say that Maxie will look in the drawer where the chocolate actually is, failing to recognize that Maxie's belief, formed when the chocolate was in the cupboard, has not been updated, that Maxie still believes the chocolate is in the cupboard even though this belief is now false. This failure to attribute false beliefs to others might seem like a simple developmental limitation, a matter of cognitive immaturity that children outgrow, but it raises deep philosophical questions about the nature of belief, the development of self-consciousness, the relationship between mind and world, and whether the ability to represent false beliefs is necessary for full-fledged thought and agency. And some philosophers have argued that the false belief paradox reveals something fundamental about the structure of cognition, that understanding false belief requires a kind of meta-representational ability, the capacity to represent representations, to think about thoughts, to hold in mind simultaneously what is the case and what someone believes to be the case, and this capacity emerges relatively late in development and may be unique to humans or shared only with a few other cognitively sophisticated species. The paradox takes its name from the tension between two facts. On the one hand, beliefs are defined by their representational content, by what they are about, and this content can be accurate or inaccurate, true or false. And so the possibility of false belief seems built into the very concept of belief, seems to be part of what makes beliefs different from mere sensations or reflexes. And on the other hand, young children seem unable to grasp this possibility, seem to treat beliefs as transparent to reality, as if what someone believes must be what is actually the case, and this suggests that the full concept of belief, the concept that includes the possibility of misrepresentation, is not innate but develops over time, requiring both cognitive maturation and social experience. The false belief paradox also appears in philosophical discussions of self-knowledge and first-person authority, because while young children struggle to attribute false beliefs to others, they seem to have access to their own beliefs in a more direct way. They can report what they believe without needing to infer it from evidence, and this asymmetry between first-person and third-person belief attribution raises questions about whether beliefs are fundamentally different when considered from the inside versus the outside. Whether self-knowledge is a special kind of knowledge with its own logic and epistemology, and whether the difficulty of understanding false belief in others reflects a deeper puzzle about how minds can be both transparent to themselves and opaque to others. Some philosophers have connected the false belief paradox to issues of rationality and acrasia, the puzzle of how someone can act against their own better judgment, can believe that an action is wrong or foolish, and yet perform it anyway, because understanding acrasia seems to require the ability to represent conflicting mental states, to hold in mind both what one judges to be best and what one is inclined to do, and this ability may depend on the same meta-representational capacity that underlies the understanding of false belief, the capacity to separate belief from reality, to recognize that mental states are states that can be at odds with each other or with the world. The false belief paradox also has implications for moral responsibility and the development of moral understanding, because attributing blame or praise to someone requires understanding their beliefs and intentions, requires recognizing that they acted based on what they believed rather than what was actually the case. And young children who cannot represent false beliefs also struggle with certain moral judgments. They tend to judge actions by their outcomes rather than by the intentions behind them, and they have difficulty understanding that someone who causes harm unintentionally, based on a false belief about the situation, is less blameworthy than someone who causes harm intentionally. And this connection between false belief understanding and moral judgment suggests that moral development depends on cognitive development, that certain moral concepts require certain cognitive capacities. The paradox raises questions about animal cognition as well, about whether non-human animals can represent false beliefs, whether they have theory of mind, and experiments with primates, corvids, and other intelligent species have produced mixed results. Some studies suggest that great apes and some birds can pass modified versions of false belief tasks, suggesting they have at least rudimentary theory of mind, while other studies find failures, and the debate continues about what these results mean, whether animals that pass simplified tasks really understand false belief, or whether they are using simpler heuristics, behavioral rules that mimic understanding without genuine meta-representation. The false belief paradox also connects to discussions of autism and neurodiversity, because individuals with autism often struggle with theory of mind tasks, including false belief tasks, even into adulthood, and this difficulty has been proposed as part of what makes social interaction challenging for autistic individuals. The inability to easily and automatically infer what others believe, intend, or know. And this has led to both therapeutic interventions designed to teach theory of mind skills and critiques of the emphasis on theory of mind, with some arguing that the focus on false belief tasks pathologizes a different cognitive style rather than a deficit, that autistic individuals may process social information differently rather than poorly, and that neurotypical people also struggle to understand autistic minds, suggesting that theory of mind failures are bidirectional, not one-sided. The paradox persists as a puzzle about the nature of mind and the development of mental concepts, about how humans come to understand that minds are representational, that beliefs can be false, that people act based on what they think rather than what is, and the failure of young children to grasp false belief reveals something profound about cognition, that the ability to represent misrepresentation is not simple or automatic, but requires a developmental achievement, a cognitive leap that transforms how we understand ourselves and others. And once this leap is made, once false belief becomes comprehensible, the social world opens up in new ways. Deception becomes possible and recognizable. Mistakes become understandable, different perspectives become appreciable, and the realization that others see the world differently, that their beliefs may not match reality or our own beliefs, becomes the foundation for empathy, communication, cooperation, and conflict. The chocolate sits in the drawer, Maxie believes it is in the cupboard, and the child must hold these two facts in mind simultaneously, must represent reality and represent Maxie's representation of reality, and for the young child this is impossible. The two collapse into one, belief and reality merge, and Maxie must look where the chocolate is, not where he believes it to be. And the child's answer reveals a mind that has not yet learned to separate map from territory, representation from represented, belief from truth. And the false belief paradox marks the boundary between a simpler cognitive world where beliefs are transparent and a more complex one where beliefs are understood as representations that can misrepresent, where minds are recognized as fallible, limited, perspectival, and where the gap between how things seem and how things are becomes a permanent feature of the social and epistemic landscape. And we who have crossed this boundary, who can easily attribute false beliefs to others, can only dimly remember what it was like before, what it was like when belief and reality were not distinguished, when other minds were opaque in a different way, not because we understood them as different, but because we did not yet understand them as minds at all. The Galileo paradox. Galileo Galilei, in his final work Discorsi e dimostrazioni matematiche, presented a paradox about infinite quantities that anticipates later discoveries in set theory and challenges intuitions about size and comparison. And the paradox concerns the relationship between the natural numbers and the perfect squares, and Galileo observed that every natural number has a unique perfect square obtained by multiplying the number by itself. And conversely, every perfect square corresponds to a unique natural number, its square root. And so there is a one-to-one correspondence between the natural numbers and the perfect squares, suggesting that there are just as many perfect squares as natural numbers, and yet the perfect squares are a proper subset of the natural numbers. Most numbers are not perfect squares. 1 is a square, 2 is not, 3 is not, 4 is a square, 5 is not, and so on, with squares becoming increasingly sparse as numbers grow larger. And this suggests that there are fewer perfect squares than natural numbers. And so Galileo's paradox is that the perfect squares seem to be both equal in number to the natural numbers by virtue of the one-to-one correspondence, and fewer in number by virtue of being a proper subset. And these two conclusions contradict each other, or seem to. And Galileo concluded that the concepts of equal, greater, and less do not apply to infinite quantities, that infinity transcends these comparisons, that we cannot meaningfully say that one infinite collection is larger or smaller than another. The paradox remained unresolved for centuries until the development of set theory by Georg Cantor in the late 19th century, and Cantor provided a systematic way to compare infinite sets, defining two sets to have the same cardinality if there exists a one-to-one correspondence between them, a bijection that pairs each element of one set with a unique element of the other. And under this definition, the natural numbers and the perfect squares have the same cardinality. Both are countably infinite. Both can be enumerated in a sequence, and the fact that the perfect squares are a proper subset of the natural numbers does not imply that they have a smaller cardinality, because infinite sets can be placed in one-to-one correspondence with proper subsets of themselves. And this property, far from being a contradiction or paradox, is the defining characteristic of infinite sets. The feature that distinguishes them from finite sets, where proper subsets always have strictly smaller cardinality. Cantor went further, showing that not all infinite sets have the same cardinality, that there is a hierarchy of infinities, that the set of real numbers is uncountably infinite, larger in a precise technical sense than the set of natural numbers. And this hierarchy extends infinitely upward, each level of infinity giving rise to larger infinities through power set constructions. And so, while Galileo's paradox shows that some infinite sets are equal in size despite one being a proper subset of the other, it does not follow that all infinite sets are equal. And the study of different sizes of infinity, of cardinal arithmetic, became a central part of set theory and mathematical logic. Galileo's paradox also raises philosophical questions about the nature of mathematical objects and the applicability of mathematics to the physical world, because if infinite sets have properties that violate finite intuitions, if the part can be equal to the whole when infinity is involved, then perhaps infinite quantities are not genuine quantities at all, but merely symbolic manipulations, mathematical fictions useful for certain purposes, but not corresponding to anything real. And this nominalist or instrumentalist view treats infinity as a convenient idealization rather than a description of actual totalities, and it sidesteps the paradox by denying that infinite collections exist, and so the paradox has no physical significance. It is merely an artifact of extending finite concepts beyond their proper domain. Others embrace the reality of infinite sets, arguing that mathematical objects exist independently of physical instantiation, that the natural numbers and the real numbers are abstract entities with determinate properties, and that Galileo's paradox reveals not a flaw in mathematics, but a truth about infinity, that infinite collections behave differently from finite collections, and that our intuitions, shaped by experience with finite quantities, must be revised when dealing with infinity. And this revision is not a retreat or a compromise, but an expansion of understanding, a recognition that reality, whether mathematical or physical, is richer and stranger than common sense suggests. The paradox also appears in physics and cosmology, in discussions of whether the universe is spatially infinite, whether it contains infinitely many galaxies, infinitely many stars, infinitely many particles, and if so, whether these infinities can be compared, whether one infinite quantity is larger than another, and whether operations like addition or subtraction are well defined for infinite quantities. And these questions do not have obvious answers. They depend on the mathematical framework used to describe the universe, on assumptions about the structure of space-time, and on whether infinite sets in mathematics correspond to infinite collections in reality. Galileo's paradox was one of the first systematic explorations of infinity, one of the first attempts to rigorously analyze what it means for a collection to be infinite, and it anticipated many of the insights that would later be formalized in set theory, and Galileo's conclusion that the usual comparisons of size do not apply to infinite quantities was both right and wrong. Wrong in that infinite sets can be compared, and some are larger than others, but right in that infinite sets do not obey the same rules as finite sets, that the part can be equal to the whole, that addition and subtraction of infinite quantities are not straightforward, and that intuition trained on finite examples is an unreliable guide. The numbers stretch to infinity, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and among them the perfect squares, 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, sparse but infinite. And the correspondence exists, each number paired with its square, each square paired with its root, and the two collections, one a subset of the other, are equal in cardinality, equal in size. And this equality, which seems to contradict the part being smaller than the whole, is not a contradiction, but a truth about infinity, a revelation that the infinite is qualitatively different from the finite, that the rules change when quantities are unbounded, and Galileo's paradox remains a landmark, the first clear formulation of the strange properties of infinite sets, the first hint that infinity would require new mathematics, new concepts, new ways of thinking about quantity and comparison. And the paradox endures, not as a problem to be solved, but as a lesson learned, a demonstration that infinity is not a large number, but a different kind of thing entirely, and that understanding it requires abandoning intuitions that serve us well in the finite realm, but mislead us when we venture into the infinite. The fixity of the past, why yesterday traps today. A philosopher asserts a principle that seems undeniable, seems like one of the most obvious truths about time, and the principle is that the past is fixed, is unchangeable, is beyond our power to affect, and what has happened, cannot be made not to have happened, and no one can change the past, can reach back through time to alter what occurred, and this fixity of the past seems like a fundamental constraint on agency, seems to limit what we can do, and yet this apparently obvious principle creates puzzles when combined with other beliefs about causation and freedom. Because if the past is fixed, and if determinism is true, then the present is also fixed, is determined by the past, and if the present is fixed, then our actions are fixed, are not up to us, are not within our control, and the fixity of the past combined with determinism leads to the conclusion that we are not free, that everything we do was already settled by factors beyond our control, and this is the fixity of the past problem, the puzzle about how the unchangeability of the past constrains present freedom, about whether fixity transfers from past to present under determinism, about whether we can have power over facts that are determined by fixed facts. And this problem is closely related to the consequence argument and the transfer principle, and resolves in similar ways, with compatibilists denying that fixity transfers and incompatibilists insisting that it does, and the fixity of the past stands as another battleground in the free will debate. Imagine the past as a vast record, every event that has ever occurred inscribed permanently, unchangeably, and this record determines, through the laws of nature, everything that will occur, everything you will do, and the record was written before you were born, was fixed billions of years ago when the universe began, and you came into existence within a universe whose future was already determined by its past, and nothing you can do can change that record, can alter what has already happened, and so nothing you can do can alter what will happen, because What will happen is fixed by what has happened, and the fixity of the past extends forward through deterministic causation to create fixity of the future. And if the future is fixed, then freedom is impossible. Then your actions are not up to you, are not within your power, are settled independently of your will. And this reasoning seems compelling, seems to show that determinism plus fixity of past equals no freedom. The fixity of the past can be formulated as a principle. For any fact about the past, no one has power over whether that fact obtained. No one can make it the case that the past was different from how it actually was, and this principle is sometimes called the necessity of the past. Though necessity is a confusing term here because the past is not logically necessary, is not necessary in all possible worlds, but is only fixed in the sense that we cannot change it, cannot affect it retroactively, and the past is settled, is beyond our control, and this settledness seems to spread forward under determinism, seems to make the present also settled, also beyond our control, and freedom disappears, is eliminated by the fixity of the past combined with deterministic causation. Visualize time as a line. The past extends behind, fixed and unchangeable, and the present is the moving point, and the future extends ahead. And if determinism is true, then the future is just as determined as the past is settled by past plus laws. And the only difference between past and future is epistemic. We know the past and do not know the future, but metaphysically they are equivalent, both determined, both fixed, and if we lack power over the past, then we also lack power over the future, because the future is determined by the past, and power does not extend across determination. And so the fixity of the past proves that determinism eliminates freedom. Compatibilists respond to fixity arguments in various ways. One response distinguishes between two kinds of fixity: what is fixed in the sense of being unchangeable retroactively, and what is fixed in the sense of being determined, and argues that while the past is fixed in the first sense, we have no power to go back and change it. The present is not fixed in the first sense, is not in the past, and our current actions determine what the present is. And so we have power over the present, even though we lack power over the past. And the two kinds of fixity are different. And the fixity of the past does not transfer to the present in the way incompatibilists claim. Another compatibilist response appeals to counterfactual power, argues that even though the past is fixed, we have the power such that if we had chosen differently, then the past would have been different. And this counterfactual power is sufficient for freedom, is what matters for responsibility, and the fixity of the past is compatible with our having counterfactual power over the present. And so determinism does not eliminate freedom, and the fixity of the past does not transfer to the present in any sense that threatens freedom. A third compatibilist response accepts that the past is fixed but denies that determinism makes the present fixed in any problematic sense, argues that being determined by the past is not the same as being beyond our control, that our choices are part of the causal chain from past to present, are among the factors that determine what happens, and having our choices be determining factors is what control consists in, is what makes actions up to us. And the fixity of the past is irrelevant, because what matters is not whether the past could have been different, but whether our current choices make a difference. And they do. They determine outcomes. And this is sufficient for freedom. Incompatibilists reject these compatibilist responses, argue that they involve verbal tricks, equivocations on power and control that obscure the real issue. And the real issue is that if the past is fixed and determines the present, then the present is also fixed, is not genuinely open, is not within our control in any sense that matters for responsibility, and compatibilist power is not real power, is a redefinition designed to make freedom compatible with determinism, and the fixity of the past, properly understood, shows that determinism eliminates genuine freedom, eliminates the kind of control required for moral responsibility. The fixity of the past also raises questions about time travel, about whether it is possible to change the past, and most philosophers accept that backward causation is impossible, that we cannot travel back and alter what occurred, because this would create paradoxes, would make it possible for you to prevent your own birth by killing your grandfather before your parents met. And such paradoxes show that the past must be fixed, must be immune to retroactive alteration. But some philosophers argue that time travel is possible as long as it is consistent, as long as any effects you have in the past are already part of the past, as it actually occurred. And this allows time travel without paradox, but requires giving up the idea that you could change the past, could make it different. And this reinforces the fixity of the past, shows that even time travel does not give power over the past. The past sits behind us, vast and unchangeable, every event recorded, every cause set in motion, and the causal chains extend from past to present, determine what is happening now, determine what you're doing, and the fixity of the past. The unchangeability of what has happened seems to make your present action also unchangeable, also fixed, also beyond your control, because if the past could not have been different, and if the past determines the present, then the present could not have been different, and you could not have done otherwise. And freedom is lost, is eliminated by the combination of fixity and determinism. And the fixity of the past remains a central problem for compatibilism, remains a challenge to explain how we can be free if our actions are determined by a past we cannot change. And the answers compatibilists offer remain controversial, remain rejected by incompatibilists who insist that fixity transfers, that unchangeability spreads from past to present under determinism, and the fixity of the past endures as a fundamental constraint on agency, a feature of time that shapes what we can and cannot do. And whether this feature eliminates freedom or merely defines its boundaries remains one of the central questions in philosophy of free will. The consequence argument, why the past makes your future inevitable. A philosopher constructs a deceptively simple argument about free will and determinism, an argument that has become one of the most influential and most discussed arguments in the free will debate. And the argument is called the consequence argument, formulated most clearly by Peter van Inwagen. And the argument aims to show that free will is incompatible with determinism, that if determinism is true, then no one has free will, that our actions are not genuinely up to us but are consequences of the past and the laws of nature, things we cannot control. And the argument proceeds through careful reasoning about what we can and cannot control, about what is and is not up to us, and it concludes that if the past and the laws determine everything, then we determine nothing. We have no control. We are not free. And this is the consequence argument, an argument for incompatibilism, for the view that determinism and free will cannot both be true, and the argument forces compatibilists to explain how we could be free if determinism is true, how our actions could be up to us if they are inevitable consequences of factors beyond our control. And the debate sparked by this argument continues, with philosophers proposing responses, defending premises, clarifying concepts, and the consequence argument remains central to contemporary discussions of free will, a challenge that every theory must address. Imagine the logical structure. Determinism says that the state of the world at any time, plus the laws of nature, entail the state of the world at all future times. Everything that happens is a consequence of what happened before, plus the laws. And now consider your action right now. Reading these words, and if determinism is true, then this action is entailed by the state of the world before you were born, plus the laws of nature, and you have no control over the state of the world before you were born. You did not cause it. You cannot change it. It is a fixed fact about the past, and you have no control over the laws of nature. You did not create them. You cannot alter them. They are what they are, independent of you. And if your action is entailed by things you have no control over, then you have no control over your action. And if you have no control over your action, then you are not free with respect to that action. And this applies to all your actions. All are consequences of the past and the laws, things beyond your control. And so if determinism is true, then you are not free. You have no free will. And this is the consequence argument in its essential form. The argument can be stated more formally using the concept of power, what we have power over, what is up to us. And the argument says that no one has power over the past, no one has power over the laws of nature, no one has power over the fact that the past and the laws entail the present. And therefore, by a transfer principle, if the present is entailed by things we have no power over, then we have no power over the present. And having power over our actions is necessary for free will, and so we lack free will. If determinism is true, and the argument is valid, the conclusion follows from the premises. And so attacking the argument requires attacking one of the premises, requires either denying that we lack power over the past and laws, which seems implausible, or denying the transfer principle, denying that lack of power transfers across entailment. Visualize the causal chain, stretching back into the past, the state of the universe billions of years ago, plus the laws of physics, determined the state 1 second later, and that state, plus the laws determined the next state. And the chain continues, moment by moment, through the formation of galaxies and stars and planets, through the evolution of life, through human history, through your birth and upbringing and this present moment. And at no point in this chain did you have control. You were not there at the beginning. You did not set the initial conditions. You did not write the laws, and the entire chain was set in motion before you existed. And your current action is the end of this chain, is the inevitable consequence of factors you did not control. And the consequence argument says, this shows you are not free. Your action was not genuinely up to you, was determined by the past. Compatibilists respond to the consequence argument in various ways. One response denies the transfer principle, argues that lack of power does not transfer across entailment in the way the argument assumes, that you can have power over a fact even if that fact is entailed by other facts you have no power over. And this response requires specifying what power means, what it is to have something be up to you. And compatibilists argue that an action is up to you if it results from your deliberation, your desires, your character, even if those psychological states were themselves determined by the past. And so the transfer principle is false. Power does not transfer, and the consequence argument fails. Another compatibilist response accepts the transfer principle, but denies that we lack power over the past in the relevant sense, argues that we do have a kind of counterfactual power over the past. We have the power such that if we had chosen differently, then the past would have been different. And this counterfactual power is sufficient for freedom, sufficient for the action to be up to us. And critics respond that counterfactual power is not real power, that being such that if you acted differently, the past would have been different is not the same as being able to act differently. And the compatibilist response confuses conditional ability with genuine ability, confuses what would have happened if things were different with what you can make happen. A third compatibilist response distinguishes between freedom and ultimate responsibility, accepts that the consequence argument shows we lack ultimate responsibility, ultimate control, the kind of control that would make us solely and completely responsible for our actions independent of all prior causes, but argues that we have enough control, enough freedom, for moral responsibility, for being proper subjects of praise and blame. And ultimate responsibility is impossible, is not required for the ordinary kind of responsibility that matters for ethics and law. And the consequence argument shows too much, shows that even libertarians who reject determinism cannot have ultimate responsibility because their actions are either caused by prior states or are random, and neither causation nor randomness gives ultimate responsibility. And so, the consequence argument does not distinguish between compatibilism and libertarianism, does not favour incompatibilism over compatibilism. Incompatibilists defend the consequence argument, defend the transfer principle, argue that compatibilist responses involve sophisticated verbal tricks, redefine freedom in ways that evacuate it of meaning, and the consequence argument reveals that if determinism is true, then we are not truly in control, are not genuinely free, and moral responsibility is undermined. And we must either reject determinism or accept that free will is an illusion, and different incompatibilists choose differently. Some become libertarians and argue that determinism is false, that quantum mechanics or agent causation or emergent properties provide room for free will, and others become hard determinists and accept that free will does not exist, that responsibility is problematic, that praise and blame need reinterpretation. The consequence argument also generates discussions about the fixity of the past, about what it means to say we have no power over the past. Because in one sense this is obvious. We cannot change what has already happened, cannot make it the case that the past was different. But in another sense, our current actions do affect what the past was. Because if we act differently now, then the past must have been different given determinism. And so there is a sense in which our actions constrain the past, and compatibilists exploit this to argue that we do have power over the past in the relevant sense, while incompatibilists insist that this is not real power, not the kind of control required for freedom. The argument stands at the centre of free will debates, forces clarification of concepts, forces philosophers to specify what freedom requires, what control means, what power involves, and whether these are compatible with determinism, and the debate is productive, generates insight, even if it does not generate consensus, and the consequence argument remains one of the most powerful arguments for incompatibilism. One of the most difficult challenges for compatibilists to answer, and Van Inwagen's formulation is elegant, is compelling, captures a deep intuition that if everything we do is the inevitable consequence of factors beyond our control, then we are not truly free and the past stretches back, determined and fixed, and the laws operate, inexorable and unchanging, and the present unfolds and the action occurs, and the consequence argument says, this action was not free, was not genuinely up to the agent, was a consequence of things beyond control, and whether this argument succeeds, whether compatibilists can answer it, remains disputed, remains central to contemporary philosophy of free will.